On behalf of myself and the Eccles A.P.E.X producer, Lauren Bird, I want to welcome you to the first event of our fall 2025 season, Revolutionary Ireland, 1916 to 23, the IRA and the Fight for Irish Freedom. I would like to thank the Eccles Foundation for their generous and continuous support of the series, Dean Jean Bereen and Associate Dean Grant Corser of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Gerald R. Sherritt Library, and the Provost's Office for making this event possible. I'd also like to remind you that today's conversation will continue this afternoon at 3 p.m. on Thunder 91.1 and on the A.P.E.X Radio Hour podcast. Lorcan Collins founded the 1916 Rebellion Walking Tour in 1996. For the past 29 years, he has conducted thousands of tours around Dublin City and the sites of the Revolutionary period. He is the author of 4 best-selling books on Revolutionary Ireland, including The Easter Rising, which was published in 2001. He conceived the idea and is series co-editor of 16 Lives, a collection of 16 books on the executed leaders of the Rising. His biography of James Connolly was published in 2012 as part of 16 Lives. He wrote the best-selling book 1916, The Rising Handbook, in 2016. His latest book is called Ireland's War of Independence, the IRA's Guerrilla Campaign, 1919 to 21. He has lectured extensively in the U.S., having visited over 30 colleges and universities, SUU being the capstone of that experience, and is a regular contributor to historical journals, radio, and TV in Ireland. I should note that we have copies of Ireland's War of Independence for sale in the lobby, and Mr. Collins will be holding a book signing after his presentation. It is now my pleasure to welcome Lorcan Collins to Southern Utah University and to the Eccles A.P.E.X stage.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, folks. It's a great pleasure to be here. Such a beautiful venue, such a beautiful hall. It makes Harry Potter's hall look a little underfunded, so congratulations to you all. As you may hear from my accent, I am from Ireland. I'm going to try and speak as neatly as possible so that you can follow what I'm saying. There's a lot of names, a lot of dates involved in our revolutionary period, so I'll try and make it as easy to kind of follow as possible. You could go back hundreds of years if you wanted, but as our period is 1916 to 23, most of what I talk to you about today will concentrate around that area. But I'm just going to go back a little to a great year, 1798. And that's when we had a big uprising against British rule in Ireland. English rule, really, I should say. Now, it was led by great men and women who were associated with an organisation called the United Irish Men. They were founded in 1791 in Belfast. One of the driving forces behind them is a lovely man. Theobald Wolfe Tone is his name. We consider him the grandfather of Irish Republican ideology. Wolfe Tone would have been joined by other fellas, Thomas Addis Emmet, Henry Joy McCracken, men with great names and great ideals as well. Who wouldn't follow a man called Henry Joy McCracken? You'd just say, here, I'm with that guy. I love his name. But they would have been of the Protestant or Presbyterian faith as well. So if I can do one thing with you today, I'd like to get rid of the myth that it was Protestants versus Catholics. What the British did in Ireland over centuries was divide us along religious grounds by making sure that the aristocracy and the elite were of the Protestant faith and ensuring that they sowed distrust amongst them with their Catholic neighbours. Now, the makeup of Ireland in 1798 would have been 70% Catholic. 13% were Presbyterian, and of course, at the very top were 17% Church of Ireland, the Protestant established church. Now, Catholics had no rights in Ireland. They couldn't even enter the Parliament. Most had lost their hold on the land as well. Imagine we had a parliament that was exclusively Protestant. Presbyterians could go to that parliament, but they rarely did because it was too expensive to do so. Now, 30,000 people were killed as a result of the 1798 uprising. And fear was the order of the day in Ireland. Half hangings, pitch capping, where tar was poured onto your head, and then your hair was ripped off, taking half your skull with it. Fear was all around. So along in 1803 came a great man, another Protestant, whose elder brother had been one of the leaders of the 1798 rebellion. His name is Robert Emmet. And Robert was only 25 years of age when he led 80 men through the streets of Dublin to attack Dublin Castle. I'll repeat that figure in case you think I made a mistake. 80 people. We might have more people here than he had for his uprising. I always say I wouldn't be brave enough to trash a Starbucks with 80. I'd say let's come back tomorrow when we have more people. But Robert Emmet tried to free Ireland, and his uprising only lasted for 2 hours. But he was captured a couple of months later and brought to a place called Green Street Courthouse, where they gave him a hanging judge by the name of Norbury. Now, it was a foregone conclusion, but a 12-hour trial ensued. His own lawyer, a man called Nally, was a tout, a rat. Everything his client told him, Nally went to Dublin Castle, where the British establishment were, and he told them what his client was saying. Do you get what I'm saying to you? And of course, at the end of the trial, Norbury put the black cloth on his head, and he sentenced young Emmet to be hanged and then beheaded as well. And he said to him, do you have anything to say for yourself by way of apology? As if Emmet was going to apologize to the judge who was going to sentence him to death. And instead he gave this 35-minute speech, so beautiful, a condemnation of centuries of misrule in Ireland. And at the very end of it, he uttered this immortal phrase, until my country has taken her place amongst the nations of the earth, then and only then let my epitaph be written, which is very beautiful. Now, I'll come back to that point at some stage. The next great period we have is known as An Gurta Mór, the Great Hunger, or the Potato Famine. And in August 1845, a newspaper in London, in England, reported that Phytophthora infestans had reached Ireland. The potatoes turned to liquid mush in the ground. They were completely inedible. But other food was grown in Ireland, which would have filled the gap. But the British allowed that food to leave Ireland in shiploads. And as a result of that, 1.5 million people died of starvation needlessly. So we talk about it as a genocide. There were 8 million people in our nation in the 1841 census, and within 7 years of the Great Hunger, between 45 and 52, 1.5 million died. Huge psychological impact on that as well. 1 million people emigrated immediately all around the world. And you know where we went. England, Scotland, Wales, Canada, Australia to a small extent, and the good old USA as well. The land of opportunity. That was the great destination. Don't ever think that people were delighted with the arrival of hordes of Irish. We were the lowest rung of the immigrant ladder. The New York Times said that the Irish were going to ruin America. Now, I think we had a good impact on America. I think we shook it up a bit, and we brought a bit of fun as well, I suppose. But we established ourselves, and some Irish people did very well here and made good money. And this would have an impact on the revolutionary period, because a lovely organization was founded in Ireland and America in the same year, 1858. In America, they're called the Fenian Brotherhood, and in Ireland, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And we collectivise them under one name, the Fenians. And they're going to use violence to overthrow British rule in Ireland. They had an uprising in 1867. Again, it wasn't great. Sadly, it failed. However, they made an attempt, and that's the important thing. But in the 1880s, in 1882, they decided to send fellas from America over to England to blow stuff up. And I'm talking about tube stations and train stations. Now, you might say to me, well, that sounds like terrorism, and I'm against that, all right? And I would say, well, you know the old phrase, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. We never call them terrorists. We call it skirmishing. They were involved in skirmishing. And one young man who was arrested for that, his name is Thomas James Clark. And the judge went mad and sentenced him to life imprisonment without parole. Now, Tom Clark did 15 years in jail altogether. And an Irishman in a British prison in those days, it was very harsh regime. If you looked at one of the guards, you got 12 days bread and water rations. You weren't given whatever books you wanted to read the way it is today in prison. It's a little bit better, but he vowed if he was ever released, he would help to free Ireland. And just coming up to the turn of the century, he was released under an amnesty. And he came back to Ireland, met a young woman down in Limerick, where he was visiting his old jail buddy, a man called John Daly. And John had 7 nieces, and one of them, Kathleen, fell in love with Tom, and they moved to America. And their wedding is very interesting because the best man at the wedding was Major John McBride, who had fought in the Boer War in South Africa, a revolutionary. He married a beautiful woman called Maud Gonne. Yeats loved her. Anybody studying poetry might know William Butler Yeats, you know. He was mad about her. Yeats asked her to marry him 6 times altogether. Now, in my opinion, anything after 3 times, you're stalking me now, okay? But she was his muse, if you will. And of course, Yeats becomes the poet of the revolutionary movement, immortalizing many of the men who were executed in his great poem, Easter 1916, with the lovely refrain, all changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. But wait till I tell you about Tom in America. He became very good friends with the head of the Fenians in America, a man called John Devoy, and he's the money guy. He's the fellow with all the dollars. And when Tom returned with Kathleen to Ireland in 1907, that great connection was re-established between the revolutionaries in Ireland and the moneyed people in America. Because revolutions, by their very nature, are expensive. What do you have to do? Well, you have to buy maybe uniforms for the army that you're going to have. You might want to rent a hall, so you need money for that. You got to maybe have a newspaper or 2 for propaganda purposes. But the most important thing you need is some form of weaponry. Now, we don't have many weapons in Ireland, but we did have a gun shop in Dublin. It was called Kelly's Gunpowder Office. It's now a Starbucks, believe it or not, and the same taste coffee, I suppose, as the gunpowder. But you couldn't walk in there and say, can I have 1,000 Lee Enfield rifles, right? It's not Tennessee Walmart. Somebody's going to say, here, listen, that's a little bit dodgy. So we needed to import weapons from Germany. And in 1914, a beautiful couple, Erskine Childers and his wife, an American, Molly Osgood was her name, Molly Childers she became. They were very rich. Her mother bought them a 50-foot yacht when they got married, a beautiful timber yacht made in Norway. But they used their wealth for nefarious purposes and brought in a shipment of 900 Mausers from Germany. And a few days later, another 600 came in. Now, if you're interested in weapons, they're from 1871. So they're Franco-Prussian era. You got to load each individual round. But we needed more weapons. And this is where a beautiful man, a humanitarian called Roger Casement, was sent to Germany to bring in a decent shipment. May I just tell you a little about Roger Casement? He blew the whistle on what was going on in the Congo under King Leopold's regime. You're familiar with how maybe 5 to 10 million people perished in the pursuit of rubber, diamonds and gold and elephant ivory. If you've ever read Joe Conrad's book, Conrad mentions him in his diary, staying with Roger Casement, my only pleasure in this hell. So Casement's a real good guy, and he spent a year and a half in Germany and got 20,000 rifles and 3 million rounds of ammunition and 10 machine guns. They loaded them on board a steamship, which they disguised as a Norwegian vessel called the Aud, A-U-D, and the basic idea was they're going to land the weapons on Easter Sunday, 1916, and that would be the day for the uprising. They chose a deep water pier in County Kerry called Feenet, near Tralee. And the choice of Easter is interesting as well. I don't need to tell you people that that has that great association with Jesus and a little bit of, you know, resurrection and insurrection. Do you see what I'm saying to you? But we expected the weapons to land bang on time, but unfortunately, they arrived a few days early. They arrived on Holy Thursday. Now, if I was smuggling, and I've often thought about this, I'd watch the coastline for a couple of weeks in advance and a couple of weeks after, but I guess we thought, well, they're Germans, they're always on time, there's no point in us wasting our time. And when they arrived early, the shipment was captured by 2 British warships and forced to sail into Cove Harbour in County Cork. And as the ship entered the harbour, Karl Spindler, the German captain, scuttled his vessel, and down to the bottom of the sea went all the weapons for the uprising. Word got to Dublin about the subsequent arrest of Roger Casement, who landed on Bannostrand from a submarine, and a man called Owen MacNeil decided to cancel the uprising at the last minute. He took out an advertisement in a newspaper. Volunteers, all parades are hereby cancelled. And he also asked a few lads to drive around Ireland, stopping the uprising. I'll just tell you about one very beautiful man, Michael Joseph O'Rahilly. He used to sign his letters, The O'Rahilly, in a harken back to the clan system, where the head of the clan had a "the" before his or her name. And he drove from Dublin down to Limerick, his native Kerry, over to West Cork and up through Tipperary, saying it's all off, lads, stay at home. So no one came out on Easter Sunday, understandably. 7 very important people met in Liberty Hall. Tom Clark, James Connolly, Patrick Henry Pearse. What a name, Patrick Henry Pearse. Thomas MacDonagh, the poet. Joe Plunkett as well. Joe is a very beautiful poet as well. And they had a meeting for 3.5 hours. Eamon Cianta left him out. They trashed out their options on Sunday morning and said, okay, no one's going to come out today, Easter Sunday. Let's go ahead tomorrow instead, Easter Monday, and kick off at 12 noon. And that's why such a small number turned out for the Easter Rising. What initially could possibly have been over 100,000 volunteers could have turned out. But sadly, when war broke out in Europe, 95% of the Irish volunteers split away, and a lot went off to join the British Army, leaving a core group of 11,000 volunteers, which is still a decent number. But now the numbers were reduced even further, down to 10% of that. They would be joined on Easter Monday by members of Fianna na HÉireann, or Na Fianna Éireann, a boy and girl scouting organisation. Very beautiful scouting organisation. Any of you who have been involved in scouts or guides will know you learn how to tie knots. Well, they also learned how to use semaphore, you know, to send messages. And they also learned how to shoulder a rifle as well. And many of those young lads would end up being IRA volunteers later on. If you're a woman, you might be attracted to Cumann na Mán, the women's volunteers, who were very active in 1916 as well. And there's one beautiful organisation, they're my favourite, they don't have to be yours, they're called the Irish Citizen Army. They were a workers' protection force because workers had been battered to death by the police in 1913 during the Great Strikes. So James Larkin and James Connolly founded an army to defend the workers, and they're called Socialist Republicans. I'll repeat that phrase because you're never going to hear that again in Utah. Socialist Republicans. Bring that home to Mommy and Daddy and see what they say about that. Now, the uprising, the idea in 1916 was to occupy key buildings in Dublin. The General Post Office would be the headquarters. The forecourts, the judicial part of Dublin, would be occupied by Edward Daly. Edward had the 7 sisters I was telling you about. He was the youngest of all those. You can imagine that he was a little bit spoiled, but he liked to drink and he liked to play cards. But he was sent up from Limerick to Dublin, where Tom Clark got him a job and got him into the volunteers, got him off the drink, and he became the commandant. Now, you might say, well, it's a little bit nepotistic. However, sometimes nepotism can be positive as well, and he proved to be a very good commandant. An area known as St. Stephen's Green was occupied by the Irish Citizen Army under Michael Mallon and a beautiful woman of the aristocracy, Countess Constance Markowitz was her name. Now, that's a Polish name, but she would have been great friends with James Connolly and great friends with William Butler Yeats as well. But she was studying art when she was in Paris, and she met a young man, Kazimierz Markowitz, who told her he was a count. And they fell in love and they got married. Now, he turned out not to be a count at all. He was the 3rd son, and only his elder brother was the count. But we've all told a little lie to a woman at a party here and there to impress them, so don't be too harsh on him. But we still give her the title Countess Markowitz because it's good propaganda that we have the working class heroes involved with the aristocrats as well. She ended up being sentenced to be executed, but it was commuted to life imprisonment as well. And she was actually very angry with the court for not giving her the same treatment as the 16 men who ended up being executed as well. Other areas that were occupied included Jacob's Biscuit Factory and an area that was occupied by Eamon de Valera, Boland's Mills and Bakery as well. Now, the uprising lasted for 6 days, so we say Easter week. But the reaction of the British was intense. They executed 14 men in Kilmainham jail, and the manner of some of the executions were very emotive. James Connolly had been wounded in action in the shoulder and in the ankle, and they strapped him to a chair in Kilmainham jail to execute him, which was pretty brutal. Joseph Plunkett married his girlfriend in Kilmainham Jail Chapel, and they were given 10 minutes to say their goodbyes, and then our brand new husband was executed. Now, every newspaper from here to New York, all around the world, Australia, England, published the story of this tragic young bride executed so awfully in that manner, okay? Now, a huge swing about in favour of the revolutionaries came about. Sinn Féin means we ourselves or ourselves alone, a very small political party founded in 1905 began to rise phenomenally. Now, when I say small, think of the Green Party of Texas, 1972, okay? That's how small they were. But imagine if I said to you, I bet you the Green Party will be the largest political party 2 years from now in America. You wouldn't believe it, but nobody would believe that Sinn Féin would rise the way they did. In 1917, they won 3 seats to Westminster Parliament out of 6. Now, Sinn Féin refused to go to Westminster Parliament. They said, well, we are going to establish our own parliament here. And in 1918, there was a post-war general election, and Sinn Féin got 73 seats out of 105 for Ireland. And instead of going to Westminster, they established Dáil Éireann on the 21st of January, 1919. More than half of the delegates were in English jails at the time. What a very interesting parliament. Half in jail. Just think about that for a little second or two, okay? So a very radical, revolutionary parliament, Dáil Éireann. Now, it's very easy for me to just lie to you and say it was all because of the executions. I want to include two other aspects of our history that brought about a change. One is votes for women. Sinn Féin campaigned for votes for women, and the British gave Britain and Ireland votes for women in 1918, but it was very restrictive. You had to be age 30. You could be a 21-year-old man, but you had to be a 30-year-old woman. Now, I'm sure I don't need to explain to anyone here that a 30-year-old woman and a 21-year-old man do not have the same intellectual capacity and decision-making capabilities. It's the other way around, in all fairness, okay? But those women who did get the vote would definitely vote for Sinn Féin. And another issue was conscription or the draft. The threat from the British was that they were going to introduce conscription. And we were vehemently against that. As far as people in Ireland were concerned, the war in Europe was their war, an imperious conflict. If you volunteered to go, fair play to you, but no way were we going to allow our children to be conscripted. So that's another reason for that huge swing about. Now, you see that date I said, the 21st of January, 1919, happens to be the day that two policemen were shot dead in Tipperary in a place called Sullah-Head-Beg by Dan Breen and Sean Tracy and Sean Hogan and their commandant, a man who had fought in 1916, Seamus Robinson. Now, the police were taken by surprise, but they were armed. And if you look on YouTube later, type in the name Dan Breen, B-R-E-E-N, and you'll see him being interviewed. And the interviewer, I think it's Cathal O'Shannon, says to him, Dan, do you have any regrets shooting the policemen and starting the war? And he says, regrets? I have regrets. I regret the fact that 6 policemen didn't turn up that day. We wanted to shoot someone, and we chose the police as the armed wing of English imperialism in Ireland. And remember, these were the same police who presided over evictions during the Great Hunger. When people were starving, they were thrown out of their houses by that very police. So obviously, this is the start of the War of Independence. And it raged for 2.5 years. And policemen began to leave their jobs. Why should they, risk life and limb for British imperialism? So Winston Churchill over in England decided to send a force. They became known as the Black and Tans and arrived on Irish soil in March 1920. Now, they were a rough lot. People used to say they were from English prisons. In my book, I show none of them had a police record. But for the actions that they carried out in Ireland, they should have been in jail. And they were bad. But there was a worse force that arrived in August 1920. They're known as the Auxiliary Division of the Police. And they were ex-officers from World War I. They were paid 3 times what an ordinary policeman was paid. And they drank and terrorised the people of Ireland. There's 2 very important people I want to tell you about in Cork, because Cork was where the big fight was. One was called Tomás McCurtain, and he was in charge of the IRA there, and he had a comrade, his second in command, Terence McSweeney. They were both elected to Cork City Council, and Tomás McCurtain was elected the mayor of Cork City. And on the 20th of March 1920, police blackened their faces with polish and burst into his home at 2 a.m. in the morning and murdered him in front of his wife and children. The man who shot him, it turned out, was a fellow called Swansea. And in turn, the IRA found out where he was. He was in a place called Lisburn, up north. And they came and shot him in August 1920 with the Lord Mayor's own gun. So quite a kind of a vengeful attack. Now, his replacement was Terence McSweeney. And McSweeney was arrested in August 1920 by the British Army. They brought him up to Dublin, and he commenced a hunger strike. And after 5 days, they sent him over to Brixton Prison in London, where he continued the hunger strike to the death, to the 74th day. Now, I know we're prone to exaggeration, but I promise you, international attention focused on Ireland at the time. Nobody had hunger struck to the death for so long before. A man called Thomas Ashe died in 1917 after being force-fed during his hunger strike. After 5 days, it went into his lung. But McSweeney drew attention. Everybody in America was grabbing the newspapers to see how McSweeney was doing. Newspapers had detailed records on a daily basis. The Pope in Rome wrote to King George, "Do not let this man die." Ho Chi Minh wrote in his diary, "I cried today when I heard Terence McSweeney died. A nation of such people shall not be defeated." And McSweeney wrote himself before he died. He said, "It is not those who can inflict the most. It is those who can endure the most who will be victorious." And that's a very important phrase to us in Ireland. Now, the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans were terrorising the people of Cork. And at the end of November, I think it's the 28th of November, one of the IRA's greatest commandants, a man called Tom Barry, got a flying column of 36 men, and he trained them for a whole week. He said, "We're going to take on the auxiliaries in a place called Kilmichael." 2 truckloads of them arrived as the IRA were waiting in the ditch. And standing in the middle of the road was Tom Barry with a handgun in his hand and a cigarette hanging out of his mouth like John Wayne. And as they approached, the 2 trucks slowed down and a hand grenade was thrown into the first truck. Crossley tenders, we called them. And pandemonium ensued and they wiped them out. 9 men were killed. They then went on to the second truck and the IRA were very victorious, and somebody shouted, "We surrender." And 3 IRA men stood up to take the surrender, and the British troops fired at them. So the IRA continued to fire at them and wiped out the second truck as well. One man, Cecil Guthrie was his name. He was the driver of the second truck, and he ran across the hills, and he knocked on a house late at night. "Help, help, the IRA are after me." And who answered the door? 2 brothers who were in the IRA, and Cecil Guthrie was never seen again. But the 16 coffins that travelled through Cork City and over to London as well, draped in Union Jack flags, were a very important message to send over to England. Now, in May 1921, the IRA set fire to a very important building in Dublin. It's called the Custom House. It was where income tax records were held. Now, who wouldn't like their income tax records being destroyed in a fire? So it was very popular, sort of an attack, but it involved 270 IRA volunteers in broad daylight. They got a truckload of paraffin oil. And paraffin is a very effective oil for burning something. Petrol is good, but it's very dangerous, and it creates a kind of a cloud of petrol fumes or gas fumes around you, you say. So if you ever want to burn something, use paraffin. You should always have a gallon or 2 on standby. You might thank me for this at some stage in your life, okay? So they had a whole truckload of paraffin, and they scattered it all over this enormous building in Dublin. And as they set fire to it, the Black and first was the auxiliaries arrived, and then the Black and Tans arrived, and there was a fierce fight, and 5 IRA men were killed, okay, and 100 were arrested. Now, a month and a half after this, on the 11th of July, 1921, the British asked for a truce. So we would be inclined to say that the burning of the Custom House, organised by Eamon de Valera, well, he ordered it, organised really by Oscar Traynor, was a very important moment for the war. Now, there are many, many other events. I'm just giving you a bit of an introduction. Something that we were talking about last night was an event called Bloody Sunday, when the IRA shot 14 spies on the 21st of November 1920. And in retaliation for that, the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries drove up to a football stadium, Croke Park, and they burst into a football match and start shooting wildly into the crowd. And they killed 14 persons as well. It's just a coincidence, it's the same number. And then they came back to Dublin Castle, where they murdered 3 prisoners, including Dick McKee and Peter Clancy, who were the Dublin IRA leaders. They were the brigadier and vice brigadier as well, okay? So there are many, many events. May I just recommend a movie, because myself and Ryan were chatting about it last night. It's called The Wind That Shakes the Barley. So if you get a chance, watch that, okay? Now, there's another one called Michael Collins, but that's a little bit dodgy. That has Julia Roberts in it, and I would always be very careful from a historical perspective of any movie that has Julia Roberts in it, except for Pretty Woman, because that's a pretty good example of what goes on there. I'll just stop while I can. I was looking at that movie recently, just going, you could not make this movie nowadays, you know. And I saw who produced it, Harvey Weinstein, and I thought, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? Like, you know, you might remember him. Anyway, we had to go over to England and negotiate a deal. So we had a truce. Now we needed to negotiate long-standing deal. And Eamon de Valera, who had been in America for a year and a half during the war, he went over to meet Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, in talks about talks. And Lloyd George said to him, look, we're going to give you this, this, and this, but we're not going to give you these other things. And then he came back and he said to the cabinet, including the great warrior, IRA Director of Intelligence, Michael Collins, he said, listen, you go and negotiate that deal. And Collins was going, you come too. And De Valera was saying, no, 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 I'll stay back here. And you can say to the British, you have to come back and talk to me about it. Now, Collins must have realised he was being set up here. Arthur Griffith also reluctantly agreed to go, and Robert Barton and a few others. Altogether, there was a delegation of about 24 or 25 went over to England. But they're also negotiating with Winston Churchill. Now, I don't like Winston Churchill. Very few Irish people do. I see a racist, a misogynist, an imperialist, a man who starved 3 million people in the Bengal to death in their false famine, when he took all their rice on behalf of the war effort in Europe and never even used the rice. And when his aides told him, you're starving those people, he said it's their own fault for breeding like rabbits. That's the Winston Churchill we think about in Ireland, okay? So Churchill was a very smart tactician, and he dealt with Michael Collins, and meanwhile, Arthur Griffith was dealing with Lloyd George. And we signed a very poor deal for Ireland. When Dev saw it, he was very annoyed, when De Valera saw it. And it was debated in Dáil Éireann. Well, I'll just give you a few points of the treaty. Ireland could not be called a republic. We had to be called the Free State. We had to dissolve that beautiful underground parliament that we founded, Dáil Éireann, and re-establish another parliament under King George, the Free State Parliament. And if you entered that parliament, you had to sign an oath to the British Crown. Now, there's nobody here would sign an oath to the British Crown to enter into your Senate today. Sure you wouldn't. I certainly wouldn't sign an oath to the British Crown. I'd rather chop my hand off than allow it to sign an oath. An American lady on a tour said to me one day, oh, Lorcan, would you do it for $1 million? And I was like, oh, no way, I wouldn't do it like for that. And then her husband said, would you do it for 25 million? And I have to say, I began to come around to the idea of signing the oath. But there are men and women who had better principles than myself, who said they would rather die than sign an oath to the Crown. And the IRA split, and Sinn Féin, the political party, split. And in April 1922, the anti-treaty IRA occupied one of the buildings that had been occupied in 1916, the Four Courts. 2 months later, an event happened over in England, when Reggie Dunn, an IRA leader in London, and Joe O'Sullivan shot dead the highest ranking British military officer from World War I. Henry Wilson was his name. Now, Henry Wilson was in charge of security in the newly created northern part of our nation. That was created in 1920 and then cemented with the treaty that we signed with the British. And to relieve pressure on northern nationalists, I believe Michael Collins ordered the London IRA to shoot this guy. Now, one of the lads, Joe Sullivan, only had one leg, so he wasn't very fast at running. And a crowd of people chased after him, and they captured him. And then his mate, Reggie, came back for him, and sadly, he was captured. Now, this is very important because the newspapers all reckoned they were anti-treaty IRA. However, it was Michael Collins, who was pro-treaty, who sent a rescue mission over to try and save the guys. Now, they failed, and the two men, sadly, were executed. But here's the important thing. The fella they shot was Winston Churchill's best friend. And Churchill got on to Michael Collins, and he said, the IRA are after shooting my friend, blow them out of it, or I'm going to come over to Dublin and do the job myself. So Michael Collins and the Free State Army borrowed British artillery and bombarded their former comrades at the end of June 1922 out of the forecourts, thus starting the Irish Civil War. Now, Dublin fell within 10 days to the Free State Army because they were getting weapons from the British, and they were considered by the British the legitimate leaders of this new Free State nation. But the IRA were brilliant tacticians and utilized guerrilla warfare again the way they did during the War of Independence. Now, I don't say we invented guerrilla warfare, but we perfected it for the 20th century. One of the finest proponents throughout the 20th century of the guerrilla style were the IRA. Anyway, the Civil War lasted 11 months. Call it a year if you want. There were some atrocious events carried out, some unforgivable things. In a place called Ballyseedy in County Kerry, 9 prisoners were taken out of Tralee jail, and they were tied in a circle by their hands, and cigarettes were put in their mouth, and a landmine was placed amongst them, and they were blown up. Now, one man luckily escaped. He was blown away. Stephen Fuller is his name, and he lived to tell the tale. But if that happened once in Kerry, it happened 3 times in a 2-week period. So the violence inflicted by the Free State against their former comrades was intense. And there were 77 official executions carried out by the Free State against anti-treaty IRA, and 150 extrajudicial executions carried out as well. So the Civil War, I mean, like your own Civil War, it's still there. The wounds are there. If you scratch it, you'll kind of see it's still infected. However, it created the political arena for the 20th century in Ireland. Eamon de Valera, who was considered the political leader of the anti-treaty IRA, swore that he would never go into the Free State Parliament. However, in 1926, he founded a political party called Fianna Fáil, the Soldiers of Destiny, and the following year was elected. And he did go into that parliament. And in 1932, his new political party became the leaders of Ireland. And he did sign the oath. He did walk in there and put his hand over the oath and signed his name in his own way, okay? But even today, the political divide is very interesting that it stretches back to a Civil War period, okay? There's something I wanted to talk about, and that is, I meant to say it during On Gorta Moor when I was talking about it. We had a visit from a very important American in August 1845, and his name is Frederick Douglass. And Douglass is very well known here, but actually also very well known in Ireland. He came for 3 weeks, and he stayed for 4 months altogether, which is quite fascinating, I think you'll agree. Douglas said he had the greatest welcome in Ireland that he ever had in his life. And there was a man at the time, Daniel O'Connell, who was campaigning for emancipation for the Irish. But every time O'Connell gave a monster meeting, he would always say, don't drink coffee, don't drink hot chocolate, which was very important, and don't eat sugar. It's all from slave plantations. And he's the one who invited Frederick Douglass over to Ireland, which is sort of fascinating. And 2 or 3 years ago, we unveiled a plaque in Dublin to Douglass, where he spoke in the Quakers Hall. And at the same time, up in Belfast, they unveiled a statue to Frederick Douglass. So if you never knew that, I hope you like that little tidbit there, so you do. I'm going to do a little radio show as well with Ryan. I think I said I was going to expand a little on events that happened in the split in our nation, but I see I have 5 minutes, so if I may, I'll just tell you a little about the more recent conflict that happened in our nation. And that started in the late 60s when Catholics were second-class citizens in the northern area, the 6 counties. Now, we don't say Northern Ireland, we say the 6 counties or the occupied territories if you want to ingratiate yourself with someone there. And housing was a very important part of it. And there was civil rights marches as well. Young students from Queen's University decided to walk from Belfast across the Derry. And they were attacked by the police and loyalists on a place called Burntollet Bridge. It's very similar to the Selma attacks as well. And photographers were there seeing young ladies, young students being beaten by batons and stoned. And it was broadcast all around the world. And at the time, loyalists were also burning Catholics out of their homes. There were pogroms going on. And in reaction to that, the IRA, who had been quite defunct, needed to be reinvigorated. And a lot of young lads broke away from the official IRA and founded a new IRA, which the newspapers at the time called the Provisional IRA, also known as the Provos. I saw on the map here you have a little town up further from here called Provo, which kind of tickled me quite a lot. It's too far for me to drive up just for a selfie, but it's very tempting all the same. But the IRA were seen by many in their communities as the only defenders against attacks from loyalists and the police. And in 1972 in Derry, there was another civil rights march, and the British Army, the Parachute Regiment, shot wildly into the people, and they killed 13 people. One man died a few months later, so it's actually 14 as well. So that's a second Bloody Sunday. That's the one that Bono and U2 sing about in Sunday, Bloody Sunday. If you ever listen to the lyrics, you'll understand why. The world's media focused on Ireland at the time, of course. Now look, the IRA did engage in a bombing campaign as well, but for the most, there was a very popular period in 1980 and 81 when hunger strikes were again led in jails in Armagh and in Long Kesh. The first hunger strike in 1980 was led by a man called the Dark, Brendan Hughes, and just as 2 prisoners were close to death, he called off the strike. But the second more important strike was led by Bobby Sands. And Bobby said, I will hunger strike to the death. And he did. And after 66 days, he died. And in some ways, you nearly say he surpassed Terence McSweeney for our generation because his name was internationally known all around the world. In fact, in those days, people watched a thing called television. Some of you younger people might have heard of it, TV. And they interrupted the show to say the hunger striker, Bobby Sands, had died. They interrupted TV in America. That's how important it was. And altogether, 10 men died on hunger strike. So it's a very interesting period for my generation because it was a very politicising period as we in Dublin, who were far removed from what was going on in the 6 counties, began to say, well, what's happening in our nation 100 miles down the road? Now, it culminated in the peace process, which is now coming up to, 30 years there. A 35-year war ended with the peace process, and a deal was signed and power sharing was agreed. And now, on a more positive note, we are very close to getting a united Ireland because of Brexit, because the British have left the European Union, and part of their so-called United Kingdom is our 6 counties. So we can't have a border between Europe and Britain on Irish soil because there's no border. The logical place is the sea. So we have a very sort of fast-moving train that's rushing headlong into a united Ireland. Someday, I hope, very soon, maybe in 10 years or 12 years, you're going to be watching CNN or Fox News, God help you, and you're going to see United Ireland declared. And you'll say, remember that idiot we went to see in the Great Hall? He was right. And if I'm wrong, you're not going to remember anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So listen, I'm going to wind up. I would really like to thank a few people. Ryan Paul, who is an incredible host, thank you very much. And Grant and Jean and Laura as well for all the work. And your wonderful Dean, thank you very much. Or as we say in Irish, Goramila Mahagwiv, thank you very much, okay? So I hope you learned something. That's the important thing, right? And great to be in Utah. I have to keep pinching myself, but there's no way I'm driving back through that gorge of death where there's trucks beside me, in front of me, behind me, honking at me, and I'm white-knuckling through this mountain going, who built this road? It's like the most dangerous stretch in the entire world, and I'm going to loop around California to get back to Las Vegas. I think that's my plan. So thanks for listening to me, and I'll see you in a bit, right? Thank you very much.